before I start this video, I'd like to mention that I play video games. I don't call myself a gamer because that word has kind of been tainted, but I play video games and I enjoy the medium. I don't play them as much as I used to, as I've started putting more work into doing this and having friends. That's not even really a joke. I feel this is important because a lot of internet gamer people don't like critique of games or their community coming from people who don't play video games. I'll probably still be branded as a fake gamer, but at least I tried. On the 29th of April 2010, a man created a YouTube channel. He initially made Let's Plays of video games, but later shifted into more scripted content that is essentially pure nonsense. On the 15th of August 2013, his channel became the most subscribed channel on the entirety of YouTube. His YouTube channel is PewDiePie, and the man who created it is Felix Schulberg. And this is not his story. In the same way that while the Lord of the Rings books have Frodo as the protagonist, despite being really about the ring, the protagonist of this story is Felix Schulberg, but it's about his fans and people who, while not his fans, are connected to his fans. From the time that the PewDiePie channel was created until now, however, especially during the mid-2010s, a lot of the jokes on the PewDiePie channel have leaned towards the racist end of the spectrum. In the words of a 2018 Wired article,
"It's not just that they've stuck with the Swedish gamer/alleged comedian as he peppered his videos with racial slurs, rape jokes, anti-Semitism, and homophobia for nearly a decade, although that's bad enough. It's also that they insist that PewDiePie somehow isn't being hateful at all."
Now, the rationalizations that both PewDiePie and his fans will use is that it was taken out of context and or a joke. So let's talk about these sorts of jokes, why they're offensive, how they became so dominant on the internet, and what forms these jokes take. And I'll be using Mr. Schulberg as my case study. And it seems like an unorthodox place to start when talking about this topic, and that's because it is. All people hold multiple identities. It's impossible to be a person without a race, sexuality, nationality, etc. However, there's a difference between your identity and what you are. For example, if you're queer and you don't know that you are, your sexuality and your identity are not the same. Now, there's a common idea in society that being a cis-het white man is the default. Because of this, when someone who doesn't fit all four of those criteria is taken seriously, there are usually three of them. For example, Kanye West is a popular figure on the right, and while he isn't white, he is a cis-het man, so he meets enough of the criteria to be generally accepted by people on the right. However, this obviously doesn't mean that he isn't racially harassed. The counter to this narrative is called intersectionality, basically the idea that black, queer, trans women are just as valid in each of those four identities as someone who holds just one of them and has default settings for the other three. I'm massively oversimplifying here because there are numerous other identities, but for the most part, these are the ones that people understand. The other things all four of these identities have in common is that they're inherent to who you are as a person. So any privileges or drawbacks you get from your identities are pure chance. If you aren't white, you just aren't white, and you don't have the benefits of white privilege. They're things you can't choose. Identities often have the ability to take pride in them. For example, Black History Month and Pride Month exist so that people who have those identities can have a time to celebrate the ways in which they vary from the cis-het white male presumptions that are made about society. However, by design, these celebrations include cis-het white men. Well, they don't. You can still be white and celebrate Black History Month, but it's a celebration of something that's inherently not you. In response, homophobes created a straight pride parade, sexists created International Men's Day, and racists created White History Month. Or at least they tried. I mean, the straight pride parade actually happened, but no one cares about your fucking sexist fake holiday, Blake. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with being proud of European heritage. In fact, we have specific festivals in the US for the descendants of specific European ethnic groups, such as Oktoberfest for alcoholics and St. Patrick's Day also for alcoholics, but specifically for ones who got 3% Irish on a 23andMe test. These holidays are fine and harmless, even though most of them involve drinking and or polluting the Chicago River. However, there's a difference between celebrating Irish culture, or whatever the fuck is the American interpretation of it is at least, and celebrating white culture, whatever that means. Part of why 23andMe exists is because so many white Americans don't know anything about their heritage. Culture is what's called an imagined community, which I don't really want to explain because I want to make an entire video about nationalism, but essentially it's all in your head. So if your family entirely forgot about your Scottish heritage, does it matter anymore? If you didn't grow up with any Scottish traditions or Scottish culture, your family being Scottish is immaterial. It's not like you can tell if someone's Scottish American just by looking at them. Because of this, American white culture is similar to European culture broadly, although different enough from any particular one that celebrating Dutch or Irish or Scottish culture can be seen as something different from normal. Because of suppressing African culture under slavery and the mixing of traditions from different groups, a similar thing is true of black culture to African culture as white culture is to European culture. However, also keep in mind that more elements were lent from white culture into black culture than vice versa, because white people are the people who are in power. White culture isn't celebrated because it doesn't need to be. Because of white privilege, white culture is what's considered the default, so celebrating white culture is if someone is telling a story about how they were a refugee and almost died trying to get to safety, and you start complaining about how hard it is to be from Ohio. However, if you don't think white privilege exists, then wouldn't it be better to not be white? Because of all the slurs you would have access to and you get to claim oppression points. So say you're a cis-het white boy on the internet who wants to claim to be a minority. Now you have a few routes by which you can do that. The first is to just straight up lie. Just claim to be black or gay or a woman. Usually they don't claim to be trans because they just unapologetically hate trans people and don't even care enough to try to make it seem like they don't. Now this does happen. In fact, I was in a Discord server with a couple of people who made homophobic jokes. I called them out on it and they claimed to be gay in order to justify it. They were straight. So while this does happen, it's not that common. People who are overtly racist go as far as to say that cis-het white men are the ones who are really oppressed, but that doesn't really fit as well into the meme-laden centrist nihilism that white boys on the internet fall into, at least until they become actual fucking fascists. However, instead of being based and claiming oppression for being working class, they decided to claim oppression on the grounds of something basically all internet white boys have in common. They play video games. And not even good ones, they play like Call of Duty and shit. In 1983, the oversaturation of bad games for the Atari 2600 system led to an event that we now call the video game crash of 1983, in which no one really wanted to buy new games because all the new ones sucked. This really fucked up the video game market in the US, and adults almost entirely stopped playing video games. In 1985, Nintendo planned to revive the industry by marketing the NES as a toy. This marketing decision in 1985 is why the audience for video games skews so young, despite that it's been an established industry for over 30 years. When Nintendo did this, they had to market the NES in a gender-segregated toy industry. They chose to market to young boys almost on a whim, and now Western gamers are mostly male. Despite that before the crash, the market for video games was much more reflective of the general population. Video games also tend to be pretty expensive. A new AAA video game typically costs $60 and consoles cost about $300. Because of this, the gaming community is typically middle or upper class, and as a consequence is also very white. Gamers also tend to be cis-het because of statistics. However, the sexualization of female characters in video games does tend to attract more men who are attracted to women. Because so many gamers hit privilege bingo, it's very easy to sell them on right-wing ideas. There's always been quite a lot of misogyny among gamers, partially due to the general misogyny that's acceptable for young boys, and partially due to the often misogynistic practices of the video game industry. However, in 2014, shit spilled over and we got Gamergate. Gamergate is kind of hard to explain and it doesn't really matter, but essentially a bunch of cis-het white male gamers got offended over high reviews of a game because it was a game about lesbians. They were suspicious of the high review scores and tried to claim that the creator of Gone Home slept with the reviewer to get a high review score. It eventually evolved into a lot of sexist online abuse of women in the video game industry. It's not good, and it also isn't relevant. This paralleled a lot of sexist abuse of a woman called Anita Sarkeesian, which got so bad that she often forwarded her death threats to the FBI. Both of these incidents stemmed from a worrying that Sarkeesian and whoever the fuck Gamergate was targeted at were somehow trying to destroy video games. An interesting theory as to why gamers are so concerned about people trying to ruin games comes from Polygon's Catherine Cross.
For the many gamers who lived through the 80s and 90s, growing up at a time when video games and Dungeons & Dragons were being scapegoated for mass shootings, suicide, and Satanism, the experience left a psychic scar that expresses itself as a violent reflex at the first sign of criticism.
I personally really like this interpretation because 1, I fucking despise the ESRB and people who try to regulate what their kids watch and play, and it's fun to blame them for Trump being elected, and 2, because I can totally see how someone could conflate criticisms of sexy costumes in games for objectifying women and criticisms of sexy costumes in games from parents for some reason. I don't get why parents were concerned about this. Because gamer culture is embroiled in so much toxic masculinity, a lot of gamers believe in the stereotype that men aren't supposed to care about things. So a lot of them believe in the snowflakes idea, And since the video game industry is so built around nostalgia, with old games so frequently remade, a lot of gamers idolize the way that things were when nobody cared, which is a term I just coined. I think that gamers are also pretty involved in geek culture, which also went reactionary in the mid-2010s. Think about all the racist and sexist abuse that the actress who played Rose in The Last Jedi received, despite that she had nothing to do with whether or not the film was good. A lot of the racist and sexist criticism in modern geek culture is built around the idea that modern media has a leftist agenda, whatever the fuck that means. It means that the main characters aren't cis-het white men. However, I kind of agree with the sentiment, not the racist, sexist part, but the idea that a lot of media can be read as an allegory for some leftist thing. A former Pixar writer named Dave Momshevitz wrote a book about the 22 rules of storytelling. These are general guidelines that help you write more interesting narratives. Rule 19 reads,
"Coincidences to get characters into trouble are great. Coincidences to get them out of it are cheating."
In the world we live in, being oppressed by your race or gender or whatever is a thing that happens, and it's an example of a factor out of your control that negatively affects you. Because of this, even non-leftist stories use this formula, often with the main character starting in a bad situation for one reason or another. In contrast, the world conservatives think we live in is one in which bad things that happen to you are your fault. The problem with this is that it creates a protagonist that's an idiot, and you find it difficult to believe that they managed to work themselves out of trouble. I feel like this contributed a lot to the gamers are oppressed meme. From the inception of the geek archetype, geeks were built upon pity. We're meant to see geeky protagonists and pity their low social standing and inability to talk to women. And it is women, these are mostly straight men, while simultaneously seeing them as the good guys because that's how underdog stories work. They can see the story similarities between the underdog geek characters and the underdog characters in the little marginalized media that they consume. Despite this underdog characterization, there are some toxically masculine problems with this ideal, mainly that the sexual allure that these characters want isn't necessarily great. They often envy characters that are shitty to their girlfriends. According to Kam Kunyo Singh and Carter Souls, authors of an article about the pernicious aspects of geek culture,
the geek imagines himself a peaceful warrior with immense power and a finesse, sensitivity, and interior world that his brutish jock competitors lack. This sensitivity, spirituality, and intelligence comes in exchange for sexual prowess, which is the one thing more athletic and conventionally attractive men have that the geek typically doesn't.
Now, some of you may have noticed some incel talking points in that explanation. An incel is essentially a sexist man who has tried to scientifically explain love and sex using anecdotal evidence. Incel stands for involuntary celibate, from which you can assume that these people typically don't have the redeeming qualities that makes women want to date them. Put a pin in that. While incels will claim that their inability to fuck is due to some problem with women, the real reason is they're just assholes and they aren't attractive or wealthy enough to offset that. However, because incels don't think of themselves as assholes, they don't realize that's a factor in getting people to date you. You might be noticing that almost all of these things are also true of gamers. If you've ever been in an Xbox Live voice chat, you'll know that internet gamers are straight assholes and unable to get women to date them. They also tend to be very young, like not teenagers or adults, but most of them are literal children, which means a lot of them are fans of PewDiePie. Here on YouTube, we have a lot of reactionary personalities that make apolitical content. If we talk in terms of left-wing people and right-wing people that make political content, it's much more balanced. However, a lot of the most popular apolitical personalities on YouTube are right-wing. I've already gotten into the reasons why. Keep in mind, many YouTubers once were or still are gaming channels. Ignoring your own personal biases based on the type of content that you watch, try to think of a YouTuber. Think of the first name that pops into your head whose content you don't watch. I'll share the 3 names that came up while I was writing this script. PewDiePie, obviously, since this is who the video is about, H3H3 Productions, and iDubbbz TV. These are some of the most popular content creators on the website. They market themselves as apolitical guys just screwing around, but sometimes their mask has slipped. Let's use PewDiePie as an example because his name's in the title. For years in his content, he's said and done some things that, to put it mildly, are not good. In 2011, he used the Swedish translation of the N-word, which in the subtitles he translated as black. He played a game of Smash or Blast with the additional option of selling into slavery, Jesus Christ. And the most blatant, and actually I would argue worse than most of the other things he's been criticized for, in a 2016 video he used a photo of black actress Leslie Jones to represent Harambe, a literal fucking gorilla. While he's been problematic for over a decade, 4 specific events got a lot of media attention, and I'd like to talk about them specifically because these are the fora in which he actually defended himself. Fora is the plural of forum, by the way, if you don't know that. Yo fam, I'm Danny and I'm here to discuss some of the controversies surrounding if PewDiePie is a racist in the only way I know how, by discussing questions surrounding whether fascism is on the rise in modern society over Apex Legends gameplay. In 2019, PewDiePie wore a shirt with this symbol on it. It looks kind of like the German Iron Cross. However, PewDiePie claimed the icon was actually a Georgian Bolnisi cross. To clarify, the Bolnisi cross looks like this, and the Iron Cross looks like this. The curved edges on the shirt are not as pronounced as in the image, but the Iron Cross does not have them at all, and the text on the collar of the shirt is clearly Georgian. I find PewDiePie not guilty. Aside from that last line, everything I just said was either objectively true or a subjective statement that is obvious enough that no one is going to argue with it. Unlike other things PewDiePie has done, this one isn't as cut and dry. It's possible that he just legitimately bought a shirt with the Bolnisi cross on it that people mistook for the Iron Cross, but I don't think that's terribly likely. PewDiePie is Swedish, his wife's Italian, and they live in the UK. There's no real reason why he would want a symbol of national pride from Georgia. You may be thinking, well, it's just a cool symbol, and I agree, but keep in mind the cross on the shirt is indistinguishable enough that if the context surrounding it showed it was the Iron Cross, it would probably pass as such, which is probably why, considering what I'll get into later, he owns this shirt. It looks enough like the Iron Cross that he can pretend it is if/when he wants to, but when he's questioned about it, he can truthfully say that it's not. Yo fam, I'm Danny and I want to discuss if PewDiePie is racist or not again. My last video was very popular, and before I start, I'd like to say that 100% of you are not subscribed. So on a stream in September of 2017, PewDiePie said the N-word to a player in an online game he was playing. After he said it, he immediately realized his mistake. He then apologized in a video titled My Response, in which he actually apologized and took responsibility for his actions. Wow, you never see that from YouTubers. I find PewDiePie not guilty. Before I say anything on this topic, you can probably tell by looking at me that I'm white, and if you can't, how? Because I'm white, I can't accurately speak on this topic, and I don't really want to try. So I'm going to go under the assumption that saying the N-word is always bad, and if you disagree with that, the door is that way. So everything my character said except the last thing is true. So the first thing that I want to say is that the only reason that word would slip out is if that's in his daily vocabulary. How do I know that? Because I've gotten very angry on online voice chat and I haven't said anything that I wouldn't have said at anyone otherwise. The role of the N-word on the internet in both overtly racist spaces and in spaces like this where the people don't think they're being racist is an interesting topic that it deserves a video in its own right. You know, maybe one made by a black person. A YouTuber that casually uses the word a lot is iDubbbz, and hilariously, Rice Gum of all people called him out for this.
How you gonna support a guy who proudly says the N-word?
You know, the same guy who did this and claimed it was fine because he's Asian. Put a pin in this, I'll get back to it later. In his video about Tana Mongeau, a chronic dumbass who is also correct in this one case, iDubbbz talks about how and why he uses the N-word. He claims that it's to retract it of his punch, which is sort of like an idea called reclaiming. The difference here is that he's white. The other thing he talks about, which I actually do kind of agree with, is that we think of the N-word as the racial slur. If you hear the phrase, he was shouting racial slurs at Denny's, one specific racial slur pops into our heads as the one he was shouting. However, just because one slur is thought of as the worst one doesn't mean that the other ones aren't as bad. Just because Tana Mongeau is fine with using the R word doesn't mean that it's fine that she did. She's an idiot, she just happened to be right about one thing. Despite that his excuse seems unlikely, his apology seems sincere. Like he seems he's realized he's in too deep and that he wants to escape and he just can't because his fan base has become so reactionary that he has to cater to them. He seems to just want to make apolitical content like he claimed his old content was, but as we'll learn, he didn't do so, which is why I think that it's a lie. He said what he knew people would accept as an apology, but he didn't actually change his behavior, and to be honest, it kind of worked. He seems so much more human in this apology than he did in any of the other ones, where he said something sort of like, I'm sorry people were offended. Yo fam, I'm Danny, back to talk about whether PewDiePie is racist once again. If you could please ring the bell and hit subscribe in that order, I would really appreciate it. Anyway, today I wanted to ask if the Christchurch shooting makes PewDiePie racist. On March 14th, 2019, a mosque shooting happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, in which 49 people were killed. The shooter's manifesto explaining why he did the crime mentioned multiple internet memes. During his live stream footage of the atrocity, the shooter said subscribe to PewDiePie, which had become a meme because PewDiePie was at risk of losing the title of the most subscribed YouTube channel. PewDiePie specifically urged his fans not to commit crimes on his behalf to spread the meme, and after the church shooting, he condemned it and made a formal request to end the meme to prevent anything further from happening in his name like this. I find PewDiePie not guilty. Again, everything I just said was true except the last sentence. However, in order to make that narrative, I had to leave a lot out. I put little numbers in the corner to cite my sources for this video, and half of the information that my source there used had to be cut because it wasn't helping PewDiePie's case. Now, I believe that PewDiePie was sincere when he condemned the shooter, saying, quote,
"Instead of the devastating reports from New Zealand Christchurch, I feel absolutely sickened having my name uttered by this person. My heart and thoughts go out to the victims' families. My heart and thoughts go out to the victims' families and everyone affected by this tragedy."
However, just because he believes that an act of terrorism that killed 49 people is wrong doesn't mean that he's blameless. While he did ask for his fans to end the meme, two other factors need to be brought into this. One is so that if anything like this happens again, he can say that he specifically requested for people not to say it. The second is that he had a video queued up at the time to post when T-Series passed him in subscribers. In his video about the song, YouTuber Boy in a Band said that the song was created in December, so PewDiePie had been sitting on the song for 3 months by the time he ended the meme, and he probably partially did it because he had already accepted that he was going to lose. So while ending the meme could be considered a move of virtue, it was probably partially saving face and partially because he wanted to upload the song. In order to determine PewDiePie's blame, you have to ask the questions: 1. Did PewDiePie radicalize the gunman? And 2. Can that be considered bad if he didn't intend to do it? I think the answer to the first is partially. I think he was partially radicalized by PewDiePie, evidenced by the subscribe to PewDiePie thing, partially by the sharp turn right of the gamer community, evidenced by references to Fortnite, and partially by the general right-wing attitude in internet memes, which I'll get into later. The answer to the second question is some philosophy bullshit, and people can have an honest debate about it. So I'm going to take the easy way out and not answer it, but if the answer is yes, PewDiePie is blood on his hands, as well as having indirectly committed hackings and graffiti to spread the subscribe to PewDiePie meme. Also, the entire subscribe to PewDiePie meme is predicated on anti-Indian racism. On the 5th of October 2018, PewDiePie released a song titled Bitch Lasagna, which used a bit of casual racism to insult the Indian Music Corporation that was at risk of surpassing PewDiePie. This isn't the same PewDiePie who 2 years prior realized his mistake of saying the N-word on stream. This leaves 3 possibilities: either that the entire apology was a lie, he slipped back into racism, or he's legitimately too oblivious to see why this is wrong. I find the last possibility unlikely because of how much he's tried to defend himself in other fora, knowing exactly what to say and how to say it. He's not stupid, he just doesn't care, or he knows that it benefits him to generate more controversy. Now, because of the meme, I actually subscribed to PewDiePie's channel back in 2018. I almost made a parody song of Bitch Lasagna called Ravioli Motherfucker in 2019, and I'm so glad I didn't because I would have unwittingly made a video that used racist stereotypes in it because I thought the phrase Ravioli Motherfucker is funny, which to be fair, it is. I didn't really believe that the attacks on him were entirely a smear campaign like a lot of his fans do. Remember the quote from the beginning? The most well-known incidents, i.e. the ones I'm addressing here, I was aware of, but I mostly believed his narrative. I do think, however, that had I known about his more appalling incidents that weren't as well known, I would have stopped watching his content. I wasn't anything more than someone who appreciated the meme because of the sense of community that was created by YouTube, since almost all of the most popular YouTubers were supporting PewDiePie in remaining the most popular creator. A lot of this was surrounding that T-Series as a corporation, while PewDiePie is run by just one guy and his team of people who work with him. Now, I agree that the most popular people on YouTube should be independent creators, not corporations. I just don't believe that it should be this guy. But I believe that 'cause I'm a socialist. To quote Ferdinand Kronenwether, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Yo fam, I'm Danny here to answer the question of if PewDiePie's Fiverr incident is anti-Semitic. Before we get into the video, if this video gets at least negative 7.2 likes, I will upload a 3 to 5 minute PowerPoint presentation about the Cuban Missile Crisis because I have to for a history assignment. So in 2017, PewDiePie hired 2 Indian men on Fiverr to send him a video of them holding up a sign that said, quote, "Death to all Jews." So that's actually pretty bad. Hi, I'm the person who wrote this video, here to say that I legitimately couldn't come up with a way to portray PewDiePie in a positive light in this segment. This thing is legitimately really fucking terrible, so just know that his defense is that it's a joke. So aside from the obvious fact, opinion, but fact, that this alleged joke isn't funny, part of PewDiePie's defense here is that he was trying to, quote,
show how crazy some of the world is, specifically some of the services available online. people on Fiverr would say anything for $5.
Now, what he meant to do doesn't matter. I personally believe that he legitimately thought the joke was funny, and there's an interesting discussion to be had about the consequences of this, but for now, it doesn't matter. I'll get to why it's bad to laugh at offensive jokes in a bit. The reason it doesn't matter is that whether or not one particular person is in his heart racist or anti-Semitic or whatever, doesn't matter. The overwhelming majority of PewDiePie's content is apolitical, so if he just kept his racist tendencies to himself, then it wouldn't matter if he's racist, because he's not doing anything to further racist ideas. The problem, however, is that he is. The Daily Stormer is a website that is overtly fascist. That's not an exaggeration. The website literally has a countdown on the side of it on how long it will be until white people are a minority in the US, which is great because now I know how long it'll be until an arbitrary date in 2043 on which literally nothing happens. They're also named after a tabloid paper that was run by the Nazi Party from 1923 to 1945. On the 22nd of January 2017, the site's editor, Andrew Anglin, said, and I quote,
"He's making the masses comfortable with our ideas."
This article is really short and also completely stupid. Like, he got distracted halfway through writing it. He randomly jumps in part way through and says, quote,
"By 2024, Sweden will be a full Islamic state."
And the word state is capitalized here, so he either doesn't understand capitalization rules or he thinks that in 3 years the entire country of Sweden will be controlled by ISIS. That's what the S stands for now, that they've lost Syria, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sweden. This article would be hilarious if it wasn't about a Nazi endorsing PewDiePie and saying, quote,
"I hope he keeps doing this. Staying chill, I mean. Not going too far. I think he's aware that he's eventually going to get banned. If he wasn't ready for that, he wouldn't be calling out all the Jews at home like this."
What matters here isn't what PewDiePie believes, it's what his fans are consuming. In the words of a YouTube comment on H. Bomber Guy's video about PewDiePie, PewDiePie may not be a Nazi, but Nazis think he is. If neo-Nazis believe that something can convince people to be neo-Nazis, they're probably right. And even if they aren't, it doesn't matter. By even trying to argue that making this joke is bad, they can make an appeal to free speech and convince 7 new people that the left is a bunch of snowflakes that are offended by dark comedy. So really, the only winning move is not to play. So let's talk about dark comedy. An important prerequisite to understanding why we find dark humor funny is understanding why we find anything funny. In her video, How Brooklyn Nine-Nine Makes a Joke, YouTuber Riley J. Dennis explains why the sitcom Brooklyn Nine-Nine is funny. Not in a way of being like, oh, this is why the premise is funny, but in a way like, here's the kind of jokes the show makes. She doesn't explain why they exhibit an emotional response, but that doesn't really matter. According to a Scientific American article, laughing holds a social purpose. There's a clear reason why we laugh. The things that make us laugh vary based on the culture. To quote the article,
"I once interviewed for a job in the Netherlands and none of my jokes landed.
I find this scenario funny because I think it's funny that someone is telling fucking hilarious jokes and some Dutch guys are like,
"Yeah, that wasn't funny, man."
I honestly prefer the scenario where there actually isn't any cultural differences between Dutch comedy and American comedy, but she just isn't funny. But I find that scenario funny because comedy is subjective. That being said, subjective comedy is usually more specific than categorizing jokes. Like, someone might be like, I don't like puns, but if you get the right pun into the right situation, you could make them laugh. So these types of jokes are character jokes, crude jokes, funny situations, defying expectations, positive relationship jokes, and punching up. Character jokes and positive relationship jokes are more specific to a plot-driven medium, so I'm going to discount them here because I'm mostly talking about short-form internet content. Every single one of these categories is self-explanatory except for the last one, punching up. Essentially, punching up is when you make a joke in which the butt of the joke is the people who are in power. This is why jokes about white people are funny when similar jokes about other races aren't. If you make a joke about how white people like Applebee's, it's funny because it's true, but if you make a joke about a similar stereotype for, say, black people, it isn't as funny regardless of how true it may be. The other factor is that people of color tend to consume more media from and about white people than the other way around, so people of color are more able to make and understand true assessments about white people than vice versa. There's a reason why race jokes, where the person telling the joke, the audience, and the butt of the joke are all the same race, are funnier than when this isn't true. The other factor is the types of stereotypes that people like to joke about. Stereotypes like white people don't like spicy food aren't really harmful, and this still would be true even if white people aren't the ones in power. In contrast, most racist jokes rely on stereotypes that are actually harmful, such as the one about black people being abandoned by their fathers or black people being criminals. Like, try to think of a stereotype around the types of food people eat, not counting things where people will generalize that people who are ethnically a certain group eat food from their country of origin. Dark humor is often also a coping mechanism. Because of the mental health problems that disproportionately affect minorities, all minorities, racial, gender, or sexual minorities, dark humor targeted at cis white men is often just that. For example, take the feminist joke, kill all men. It's obviously a joke for a few reasons. First, this would be impossible since men make up roughly 50% of the population. Second, this would be impossible because only men are in power. Third, this is an objectively terrible idea because doing this would lead to the extinction of the human race. And fourth, most women are straight, so the surviving population would be incredibly depressed if this plan were to go through. However, the reason why women say this is because a majority of women have been sexually abused by men. Despite this obvious joke, reactionaries try to take it as if it's an actual argument and use those 4 points I made, although not the second one because they don't believe patriarchy exists, against it. This has led to a response to that joke. Not kill all women, which still wouldn't be great, but at least would still have 3 of the same problems. Instead, they come up with rape all women, which at least they're being realistic about their ambitions. This already basically happens. The difference between these jokes is because a joke stereotyping those in power doesn't have a carried threat. When jokes like this are made about white people or men, 999 times out of 1,000, it's a joke. In contrast, if you make a joke about black people, it's quite rarely a joke, and people who are actually being racist often mask their intentions as jokes, which means that it's impossible to tell a race joke that was actually intended as a joke from someone who is lying about it being a joke because they think it means they can't be criticized. This is why things like this are bad, because it allows people who are actually racist to mask their racism by claiming it's a joke. You see, the internet has a habit of claiming things were jokes even though they aren't funny because they think that absolves them. On the internet, there's a concept called Schrodinger's douchebag. Schrodinger's douchebag is someone who says something offensive and retroactively decides if the statement was a joke based on whether or not people were offended, as means to save their own reputation. What PewDiePie did was literally just Schrodinger's douchebag. He didn't even make a joke or anything resembling one, not even an anti-Semitic joke. Nothing that PewDiePie did in that video was a joke, and I believe that even neo-Nazis would agree with that if forced to tell the truth. Offensive jokes aren't funny, but I can see how you could think they would be if you already believe in the offensive assumptions they're built upon. This wasn't funny because it's just a random anti-Semitic slogan in a random place. All of this is essentially to say what Riley J. Dennis said in her video in 30 seconds.
In comedy, you want to be punching up at the people in charge, the oppressors, the people with power. You don't want to be punching down at the marginalized people, the people without power. When you punch up at the powerful, you challenge the status quo. You make people think about things in a way they may not have before. When you punch down at the powerless, you're simply doing what the powerful have been doing for a long time. You become a part of the status quo, reinforcing old stereotypes and prejudices.
A lot of other offensive so-called jokes don't fit any of the other types of comedy. A joke about how women don't care about men's love for video games isn't funny. It's not crude, it's not a funny situation, it doesn't defy expectations. The reason why people find these jokes funny is simple, because they're relatable. Relatable comedy isn't on that list of types of jokes, mostly because the characters in Brooklyn Nine-Nine are so nonsensical that they rarely get into relatable situations, but there are quite a few jokes in the show that are relatable. In the context of this particular sexist joke, most people have had someone say something ignorant about one of their hobbies. The difference here is that instead of the butt of the joke being people who don't understand games, it's specifically women, because women are stereotyped as not understanding video games. A few times I've already mentioned that these jokes are only funny if you already believe the stereotypes they're predicated on. This is why, if you replace the sexist part and change it so that the butt of the joke is people who don't understand video games, then the joke is funny. Because of this, the joke can only be funny if you believe the stereotype. This isn't to say that stereotypes can't be used to tell funny jokes, however, if you are doing that, you should be subverting it. A joke like this would rely on subverting your expectations by using a setup for an offensive joke, but then saying something else. Another way you can do this is to lampshade the offensive behavior. This can be done in a character-driven medium by having another character call them out, or in a non-character-driven medium by putting the joke in a context in which it's obvious we're supposed to agree with the conceit of the joke. A good example of this is that every once in a while on Saturday Night Live, the hosts of the weekly Weekend Update segment will give each other jokes to read for the first time on live television. One of the hosts, Michael Che, is black and uses this opportunity to make his white co-host say racist jokes. Because the audience knows the jokes were written by a black person specifically to make a white person look racist, and that the white person saying the joke doesn't actually believe the things he's saying, the joke changes. Instead of being a joke that's relying on a stereotype, it's a joke that relies on the context. What Colin Jost says doesn't really matter, and the joke is that it's racist and he's being forced to say it. There's a fine line to cross here, and people saying offensive jokes and then commenting on how they're offensive in an unfunny way doesn't fit this description, but it can be done. Now, when someone is called out for making a racist joke, they'll say, "Oh, you just don't understand dark comedy." To which I say, have you ever looked at any of my body of work on this website ever? Dark comedy is what I do. I've made jokes about war crimes and cannibalism just because I think it's funny. The difference, though, is that war crimes and cannibalism are actions. Saying you're going to eat someone is not the action of eating someone, whereas saying something racist is racist. Think of it like this. Say you're being sworn into elected office. By saying you accept the office, you are also accepting the office both legally and socially. Racism is like that. By saying something racist, you are doing a racism. Because of this isn't really dark comedy in the same way that killing someone as a joke isn't dark comedy. Dark comedy is a way to point to something you can't do while not doing it. However, since making a racist joke is being racist, you aren't doing that. Now, despite not being dark comedy, racist stereotypes can still be comedy, albeit bad comedy that's only funny to racists. You can make a racist joke that defies expectations, put a pin in that, or is also a funny situation, which makes it a joke. It doesn't make it a good one because it's still racist, but at the very least it's a joke and you can classify it as such. Hiring someone to hold a sign that advocates for genocide isn't a joke, it's just anti-Semitic. Now, it isn't a joke, it doesn't really count as one, but it can still be a little bit funny. Part of me actually does think that this is funny, but the part that's funny isn't what's on the sign. The sign could say anything so long as it's sufficiently unexpected. Say the sign instead said something like "Death to all pineapple pizza eaters." When it doesn't target a group that's actually marginalized, the shock value of how dark it is makes it funny. In 1988, Pittsburgh's WBZZ radio station had a segment called Stupid Human Tricks, which basically entailed the host asking people to do stupid shit on air. In one particular incident, they asked a caller to take off his pants, which is pretty concerning considering that at the time, the hosts were embroiled in a sexual harassment lawsuit. The caller taking his pants off eventually caused a car accident. Essentially, the problem with this is that it creates an arms race where everyone tries to do increasingly worse things for attention. To quote another radio host at the time,
"Things are getting so competitive that within the next year or two, the people who don't have their act together will be weeded out. So some people will be trying to call attention to themselves."
To an extent, that 62-year-old radio host predicted internet shock humor in 1988. I never thought I'd say that sentence. Now let's take out our first pin. Well, actually, this is the most recent pin, but it's the first one we're taking out. If you make a racist joke that's shock comedy, the reason why people find the joke funny is because it defies their expectations. However, because of this game of one-upmanship, a bunch of other people will say similar things, and some people will say things that are worse. This changes what the expectations are, and the joke no longer works as subversion. This offensive joke arms race trends towards the most extreme forms of comedy, which is why communities where the moderators have little regard for policing offensive jokes are hyper-reactionary cesspits. Like most jokes, even dark jokes, most memes are completely apolitical. Memes are inherently jokes. Some jokes you'll never understand because you weren't present for the event it's referencing, some are entirely dependent on you knowing about the piece of media they're referencing, and some are just total nonsense because that's funny for some reason. And the overwhelming majority of memes, even on reactionary-leaning subreddits, are apolitical. The problem with this is that in these spaces, being offensive isn't seen as political, but protesting being offensive is. What is considered political in these spaces is whatever politics the majority of the people in them disagree with. So political memes are tolerated so long as they don't appear to be political. For this reason, the few good political memes on these subreddits are ones that actually have really high support. For example, 63% of Americans support government healthcare, and that's a common topic of memes on these subreddits. I feel like using an academic tone to refer to these meme subreddits is probably a bad idea, because it'll make all the meme words seem out of place, but I don't really care. Government-sponsored healthcare is very popular outside of the US. I can't find any definitive statistics for the entire rest of the world for obvious reasons, but here's a map of countries with free public healthcare, and here's a map of countries by how much of the population has internet access. Now this seems to disprove the trend I'm trying to prove, however, remember at the start of the video when I talked about intersectionality. People can have overlapping identities, and people can have overlapping political beliefs, such as being anti-Semitic and being a socialist. For example, Karl Marx was really anti-Semitic. He was also Jewish, which is what we in the business call a contradiction. So let's talk about some specifics because I hate myself. r/dank memes is a meme subreddit that is very popular and has a reputation on leftist Reddit for being reactionary. Before I get into this, I'm not an outsider. I was a member of this subreddit for over 2 years. So let's discuss some examples. I'm not going to read these memes, but I will explain the reasons why these aren't good. This first meme is built on a misunderstanding of how sexual assault trials go. Usually sex crimes go unpunished because if the victim is a woman, men assume she's lying in order to get men they don't like sent to prison or take their money. And even if it's cut and dry, if there's video evidence or if the rapist admitted it to his friends, which happens a lot more often than you'd think, there's a lot of victim blaming. And if the victim is a man, as this meme implies, men are shamed for getting raped because it's assumed that they should like it, and a lot of men envy men who get raped by attractive women. So this meme is basically criticizing the rule that if someone is drunk, they cannot consent. It implies that this rule would be enforced even if the lack of consent went the other way. The most likely thing to happen in this case is nothing. The problem with this meme is that it perpetuates the idea that women can just falsely accuse men of sexual assault in order to gain power, which almost never works even when the accusations are real, and that it implies that because of a rare edge case that has probably never happened, a rule about consent should not exist. One of the most prevalent memes on subreddits like this is a reverence of one elongated muskrat. Elon Musk will be portrayed by this image of him playing Wario on Saturday Night Live. He is at time of recording the third richest person on planet Earth, behind Jeff Bezos and someone you've never heard of. Seriously, who the fuck is this guy? Musk's fans view him as a visionary, as the way humanity gets to Mars, for the most part because that's the image he portrays of himself. He thinks he makes cool technology and is innovating the future. To an extent, I want to think of him this way. Making space travel something people can buy is cool as hell. His fans think of Elon Musk as one of the good billionaires, even though he isn't. He's just as money hungry as the rest of them, and his exploitation of workers is arguably worse than a lot of other more hated billionaires. He lies about his upbringing so he can have a rags to riches story. He named his kid This, which I can't even begin to figure out how to try to pronounce. And most importantly, for these purposes, he's gotten into some Twitter meltdowns. These include complaining about pronouns, which aside from not understanding that pronouns are a fucking part of speech, happened after he named his kid This bullshit. Elon Musk tries to market himself as a meme enthusiast who just so happens to be a centibillionaire. He does a bunch of things that are memes, probably in order to cultivate an audience of memers who appreciate these stunts. He changed the price of the Tesla Model S to $69,420. He tweeted about genetically engineered cat girls, and he got really into Dogecoin and then crashed it on live on national television. Most importantly for the association between Muskrat and PewDiePie, in February of 2019, Elon Musk hosted PewDiePie's meme review show. This started as a joke among PewDiePie's fans, and when it became a reality, it was very successful. Elon Musk's fans were rated as the most toxic internet fandom on that Wired piece from the start. Now, I don't want to say that Elon Musk necessarily supports what PewDiePie is doing. He clearly doesn't want to kill all black people, because if he did, who would work for little pay in his father's emerald mine? Elon Musk is essentially exploiting this meme community into being convinced that he's one of the good billionaires. And he isn't. Another common theme on these mainstream meme subreddits is that they really like to lean into East Asian stereotypes. These include but are not limited to stereotypes about Asian parents accusing their kids for low grades, about Asians looking the same, about Asians being good at math, linking the cards to why that's not actually a compliment, and most importantly for our purposes, stereotypes about East Asians, sometimes confined to just Chinese people eating meat from animals that we consider to be pets. Time to take out another one of our pins to discuss the rice gum thing, because it's pretty important to this particular meme's popularity. First off, note that rice gum's audience contains a lot of people who enjoy and make memes, so we're talking about the same pool of people as r/memes. Second off, rice gum started off as a gaming YouTuber, so the audience was mostly cishet white male gamers. And third off, rice gum's audience was and is young and impressionable. All this is to say is that there's a pretty good chance that this incident contributed to the popularity of this meme. So how did this go down? Yo fam, it's me, Danny, going to change things up because instead of discussing PewDiePie, I'm going to discuss rice gum. I want to address the claims. I'm not racist, you can tell because I play as Lifeline in Apex Legends. I also play as Caustic, the guy who goes around with gas as his main weapon, but that's not the point. So in June of 2018, Rice Gum made a typical YouTube prank video going around Hong Kong pranking people. He touched some people's hands on the escalator. He asked a guy to eat some ice cream. He asked people where to find dogs and cats. You know, these pranks kind of suck. People thought he was being racist, but he's Asian, and he specifically said that the goal was to try to disprove the stereotype, and it was a prank. I find Rice Gum innocent. Everything except the last part there is true. However, the problem is that he was just harassing people. It would have been so much easier if he wanted to disprove the stereotypes to just look at the menus of nearby restaurants. He didn't have to do what was essentially just racistly harassing people. He also went in under the assumption that the stereotype was true based on his surprise when he couldn't find anything. The fact that he's Asian doesn't matter here because he isn't making a joke about the stereotype. What he's doing is just perpetuating it by harassing people. He did say something akin to, "See guys, the stereotype isn't true" at the end, but this is inconsistent with his expectations and also probably doesn't do a whole lot since a lot of people don't watch to the end of the video. So a lot of people would have either learned about the stereotype or had it reinforced and then left before it was proven to be false. There are better ways to have done this, for example, not doing it at all. However, if you were going to do it, it should have been framed from an angle of trying to disprove it and then succeeding rather than trying to prove it and failing. A lot of the memes that can be seen as offensive to Asians on r/dank memes mention that the creators are Asian. For some of the stereotypes, this is fine. For example, the ones about Asian parents are fine for Asians to joke about because they are built around legitimate trauma. However, certain other stereotypes, not so much. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, historian Ibram X. Kendi recounts his childhood experience of middle-class black people using racist language on lower-class black people. This is essentially a way to change the location of a divide by uniting parts of a marginalized community with the oppressors against the rest of that marginalized community. This happens all the time. In the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Irish Americans and Italian Americans weren't considered white, then they only were considered to be white after they united with the people who were already considered white in supporting. You see, it's a callback joke to a video no one watched. The same thing is happening again now in the trans community with figures such as Blair White, Calvin Darragh, and Caitlyn Jenner being more accepted by mainstream cis people because they try to oppose the existence of non-binary people and trans people in sport. What Reston is doing in this video is essentially this. He's making a divide between himself as an Asian American and the people he's harassing as Asians living in Asia. So what does this have to do with r/dank memes? Well, Reston's fans tend to be super online preteen boys. They're entertained by memes, but not at their source. They're the people who watch the shitty meme compilation videos. They consume memes, but they do not create them. And they also tend to be gamers and fans of PewDiePie. While the people who graduate from these ideologies into becoming fascists tend to be quite a bit older, the main demographic here is preteen and teenage boys. Because of toxic masculinity, this is a pretty easy pool to recruit from if part of the job description is being an asshole. Time to remove another pen. It's time to talk about incels. Incels tend to recruit from the pool of men who suck too much to get laid, meaning that teenage boys who just don't talk to girls relate to incels, albeit for different reasons. This is where we get incel-y memes, implying things such as the only girls who want to date them are ugly or fat or trans, which they obviously fucking despise. Now, self-deprecating humor is obviously fine. That's why people can make jokes about their own identities. The difference is that this is a joke that is only self-deprecating if we assume the assumptions the joke is built upon are correct. Now, these assumptions aren't themselves incel-y. The assumptions are made by the culture as a whole, but specifically using these assumptions in this way is an incel idea. Incels believe that every factor about themselves except for their physical appearance is perfect. Since as cis-het white men, those things haven't been things they've been insulted for. They've probably been insulted for behavior that's seen as gay, but they've selectively removed that from their behavior. So since the one thing that they were insecure in is their appearance, they blame everything on that until their entire worldview of dating is dependent on it. Incels are characterized by believing only women they believe are physically unattractive will want to date them, and believing that them being physically unattractive is the reason. And these people are almost all gamers as well. The classic incel attire is a Call of Duty Black Ops t-shirt, and if you'll recall back to over 45 minutes ago, Jesus Christ, I mentioned that Call of Duty is a game that shitty white boy gamers play. You may know these people as the MLG, Mountain Dew, and Doritos subculture, and that assessment is correct. r/dank memes and PewDiePie's YouTube channel are just a few nodes on a massive graph of connections between different subreddits, YouTube channels, and websites, some of which no longer exist. Some of these spaces would communicate with each other if it weren't for the ideology because of their love of super boring-ass video games like Jesus Christ, cracked open a Celeste or something. Video games are the disease vector, although they are not the disease. Gamers will try to say this is me saying that games shouldn't be targeted at straight white men, since this is the reason I gave for why gamer spaces are so toxic. I don't think anything can be done except make games more popular for everyone. If you don't want gamers to be stigmatized for being a homogeneous group, allow the community to become more heterogeneous. And this is happening, not just to gamer spaces, but to the Reddit meme community as a whole. On the 16th of June 2015, Donald Trump announced that he would be running for president in the 2016 election. Now, you may be wondering why I'm talking about this guy for a few reasons. The first is that he's not president anymore, and the second is that this section is called The Light at the End of the Tunnel. But Trump being elected president is like, instead of the tunnel ending, you got eaten by a shark inside the tunnel on land somehow, and then 40 years later you saw the light at the end of the tunnel, but the end of the tunnel is just the outside of a shark's asshole. Because of Trump's election, Gen Z got our shit together to rally against him. A lot of people who couldn't even vote yet became politically engaged younger than their parents did, which is part of why I think the voting age should be lowered. Despite how off topic this entire tangent seems, it actually matters for purposes involving memes on Reddit. Overall, Reddit memes have been moving further left, and I think there's a few reasons why this is happening. The first one is that teenagers now were not using these gamer spaces until after the spaces had become so far gone that if you weren't already a Nazi, you probably wouldn't be taken seriously in the community, and there's not much entertainment value gained from doing so once you're there. We think of Gen Z as being people like this, but keep in mind that even those people about 5 years ago were all white boys who played sports games and first-person shooters. That was me, but I moved on now, and I think that if my character traits were isolated and people were asked to guess what generation that person is, they'd guess Gen Z. Now, generations are dumb, but there is quite a bit of divide between the memes that millennials make and the memes that Gen Z makes. For example, the onion with arms image from earlier is 100% a Gen Z meme. Gen Z memes are characterized by stock photos, word art, and weird shit happening for no reason. Because Gen Z has begun to take more of a foothold in the meme community, the offensive memes have become less successful and the leftist memes have become more successful. I don't think it will be possible to drive the reactionaries entirely off of the meme subreddits, partially because if that did happen, they'd just create a new one, like what happened with the Twitter Nazis and Parler, and partially because they control the mods. However, this has happened. r/196 is a subreddit that I don't know how to say out loud. I've never heard it spoken, so I don't know what I'm going to say. I'm just going to go with 196. r/196 is ostensibly a social experiment where a subreddit is created with the sole rule that if you go to the subreddit's homepage, you have to post something before you leave it. This server could have become anything, since the server has no stated goal and no rules policing what content can and can't be posted. But what it ended up being was a leftist meme subreddit. Its memes are highly critical of r/political compass memes, highly critical of Elon Musk and r/Wall Street bets, and are really into femboys for some reason. Essentially, this meme is what r/196 is. Although there is a fair share of just nonsense, despite this nonsensicality, there's a lot of anti-fascist and anti-capitalist memes on r/196. One of the user flares just says trans rights, which is a meme in its own right outside of 196. It's actually a genius meme because you can push someone into a corner by asking them to say trans rights for the meme. They don't have to believe it, but keep in mind that ironic anti-Semitism, such as what PewDiePie was doing, is part of what led to the uptick in actual anti-Semitism. By doing this in the other direction, making it trendy to, ironically or otherwise, support trans rights, we can get the people who don't support trans rights and are only saying it for the meme to maybe be convinced to actually do so. I think the support of trans rights is another factor that led to the moving left in the meme community. You know how I said that most gamers are cis men and most people in the meme community are gamers? Well, because so much of the meme community is AMAB, as more and more trans people come out, a lot of trans women end up in the meme community. So a lot of them are queer because the meme community is presumably straight, presumably men. These trans women are introducing a female perspective, a trans perspective, and a queer perspective into these spaces. It has been shown that surrounding yourself with diverse people, socially or parasocially, can make you more accepting. It also makes you more creative, which is probably why r/DickMemes finds 55,000 ways of telling the exact same joke until they oversaturate their subreddit and the meme dies in a weekend. Despite that the same processes that caused r/196 to be the place that it is are occurring across most of the rest of the internet, most of the rest of Reddit fucking hates r/196's guts, which they respond to by accurately calling them all racist, transphobic, sexist, homophobic, or whichever they find a screenshot of first, honestly. The internet sucks sometimes, partially because of these shitty white boys with their taste in video games and their 30-year-old equivalent that are marginally more mature. The internet is currently dominated by people like that, which is why safe spaces are a thing. They're designed to keep people like that out. Despite that these people are often really terrible, their ideology is at its core just that centrist nihilism, which can be easily molded into anything else. The Nazis are too far gone, we shouldn't even try to convert them, but your average gamer isn't. And the best way to defeat an army is to cut off its supply line.